Welcome everybody to Leadership Link, which is a space where we rethink leadership, through dialogue with amazing leadership experts, consultants, speakers, and authors. And today we have an amazing show here on Leadership Link. This is being streamed live to various social media platforms at this moment, YouTube, Facebook. So hopefully you'll be able to catch it. If not, you can take a look at this video after it's presented live. So today on Leadership Link, we have a very special guest. His name is Bob Tiede, and he's going to talk about leading with questions. Now, a little bit about Bob. Bob is a member of Cru U.S. leadership development team for almost 5 decades now, and he is the creator of the blog Leading with Questions on its 8th anniversary this year. So happy anniversary to the blog. He's going to tell us a little bit about that. And plus, Bob is an accomplished author. He is an author. On his blog, he calls them resources, but these are books, definitely. They have a lot of substance. And there they are. And obviously, the theme of these books is always in relation to his blog. Leaders Ask Questions is the first one. Now, that's a good question, which is his most recent. And I understand that it is translated into multiple languages. He'll tell us about that. And 339 questions Jesus asked. So very, very interesting. The books he has written, he'll tell us about that. And again, today, the topic is Leading with Questions with Bob Tiede. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and kick off the show with our video before we start. Give us a second. Hello, everybody. I just realized I was on mute, so sorry about that. These live events all summarize what you weren't able to hear. Today I have Bob Tiede summarizing. He's going to talk about leading with questions. He's an author. Let's go at it again so you can actually hear me on this on the live. He has 3 books. Leaders Ask Questions. Great Leaders Ask Questions. Now that's a great question. And 339 questions Jesus asked. Again, saying what I said before, Bob Tiede is a member of Cru U.S. leadership team. He's been doing that for almost 5 decades, and he's the creator of the recognized blog Leading with Questions on its 8th anniversary. Once we've done that again, and without further ado, we have here Mr. Bob Tiede. Welcome.
Roberto, I've been looking forward to this.
Hey, I apologize. After I said that whole bit, I'm like, oops, I am muted. All right, but hey, that happens. That's part of the
I heard every word. But
you heard every.
I did.
All right. Well, it's great to have you on the show, and to begin with, that's a big introduction. Tell us about Cru, because I'm really curious about what that stands for. And you've been there for almost 5 decades. So tell us very quickly about that.
Well, Cru, as of about maybe 7 years ago, is the new name for an organization called Campus Crusade for Christ.
Okay.
And our organization was founded in 1951 at UCLA. But today we have about 25,000 staff in 190 countries. And as you go around the globe, each country may choose their own name. And so not all of the organization is Cru or Campus Crusade for Christ. In Europe, it's called Agape. In Canada, it's called Power to Change. I'm not sure what it's called in Mexico.
Oh, we've got to check that out.
Yeah, actually. But there's many different names. And Cru it's a name kind of like Starbucks or Nike, meaning it doesn't have meaning in and of itself, but what we do is given it meaning. And another little story is when we went through a name change, we hired a group that does that, branding and names and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And when they did the test, they had room for one more name. And students for many, many years, just like students, at least in English, I assume maybe in Spanish, the same thing. But students won't say that they're taking psychology. They will say, I'm taking psych. They won't say, I'm going to sociology class. I'm going to soc. Well, students, instead of saying, I'm going to the Campus Crusade for Christ meeting, would say, I'm going to the Cru meeting. And so it was the spontaneous abbreviation by which many students had already been calling the organization. And it turned out when we tested all those names, Cru, C-R-U, tested above all the other names the branding company had come up with.
Interesting, right? Because people had already taken to the name, and it's not a direct acronym though, but it's still, it's Crusade, right? Crusade Cru, right? So it's kind of abbreviation of that word.
Yep.
Well, amazing, amazing. You've been there for almost 5 decades.
Roberto, I obviously have no ability to get a new job.
Well, I mean, beyond that, well, hey, Leading with Questions, definitely an amazing blog. I've loved it since I came in contact with it about 3 or 4 years ago, actually. So I went in, I got in contact with this when you already had 4 years into this. But anyways, moving through this information about you, I really want to talk about Leading with Questions because I think it's powerful. I myself have been trained as a coach, as an executive and leadership coach. And in coaching, questions are per se one of the most powerful tools a coach has to develop an executive or a leader in session. But we're talking about a little bit different, about something that's a lot more dynamic and not so controlled, like in a coaching session. So I'd like to basically start. Well, before that, I'd like you to tell us about your authorship. Tell us about these 3 books that you've written before we get into all this other stuff.
Well, thank you. All of the books have 2 of them actually have come straight out of the blog. And people, sometimes an author could sit down actually to write a book. But what I did is I wrote many blog posts. And the first book, Great Leaders Ask Questions, my thought was, well, the subtitle is a Fortune 100 list. And so I actually, at that point, and I think it's about 4 years ago, I went through all the blog posts. I post twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays. So each year, that's going to be roughly 100. So I had about 400 posts, and I went through and I pulled out what I thought, I like this question. Or sometimes it was a series of 3 related questions. I like those. And I pulled those all out. But when I just had the questions, Roberto, it seemed a little bit flat. It's kind of like seeing the ingredients for chocolate chip cookies laid out on the table or counter. It doesn't look all that appealing once you bake them.
Of course.
And so what I did is I went back into the posts and I got maybe a paragraph of context around each question so that context gives a little story. So in that book, Great Leaders Ask Questions, there is 100 questions, but they're wrapped in stories.
Of course.
And so we put that out. Also, it's available as an audiobook. It's also available in Spanish, both as free ebook and free audiobook.
Awesome.
And what was amazing to me was when the book got out, I didn't feel like I'd gotten any smarter just because I wrote a book. But what immediately happened is people said, Bob's written a book, so he must be an expert on this. And I was looking around like I haven't changed. But it opened up so many doors to do podcasts, radio interviews, and the number of subscribers, people following my blog skyrocketed.
Right.
And so it was really with that led me to the second book. But I'm fond of saying, you've already read this book. And people say, no, I don't think I've ever seen it before. And I say, well, notice the subtitle. It says compiled by Bob Tiede, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote it. If you've read the four Gospels, you've read this. All I
Yeah.
did was I went through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I pulled out the questions Jesus had asked. And so it's a compilation of all the questions. And when you add up, at least in the English New International Version of the Bible, there's 339.
Wow.
But it's fascinating. And maybe we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then the most recent book, now that's a great question. I even have to look at the index. There's 30 chapters.
Wow.
And each chapter was at one time a blog post. So
Okay.
I just collected the best blog posts of the last, this went out a year ago, 7 years, and put them together in a book. But again, the book has had just a great success. And Roberto, some people wonder why I do this, but everything I do is free. So this can be downloaded as a free ebook or downloaded. I went into a radio studio and recorded it. And again, one of my Spanish friends, a wonderful woman who grew up in Mexico City, who is an on-air radio personality at a Spanish station in Chicago. She was kind enough to record it in Spanish, available as a free MP3 audiobook. But that's kind of the story on the books.
Awesome. And for example, but I see that there's a physical book there. So did you go to a publisher? How did you publish these physical books? Who did the covers for them? Who did kind of like, did you do that yourself, or did you get your help, get your help for that?
Yeah. I work with a group called Weaving Influence that they have a graphic artist, a wonderful graphic artist. She has done that. And in turn, they've done the layout. You know, it's not like a magazine layout, but nevertheless, a book has to be laid out page by page so it looks right. And they assisted with that. They actually assist me with everything related to my blog. I do the blog posts or inquire and invite a guest author to do a guest post.
Yes,
but all the things behind the scenes, like managing the subscribers. Subscribing is free, but nevertheless, it has to be managed.
Of course.
And the system to send out all the blog posts and all of that. So they assist. And yes, I am showing you a physical book. However, I have only a limited number, and I don't sell them. These are available just for friends. They're available for podcast hosts, radio hosts, people that would like something, physical. But again, just because of finances, everything is made available for free on my blog, but it's an ebook or a MP3 audiobook.
Got it. Understood. And I think I would consider saying to everybody who is looking at this video now, who's watching it and watching it in the future, there is a value of actually coming out with a book, but beyond the marketable aspects, I think it's about adding value to people. And in a book form, you're able to spread out that knowledge, specifically when it's, first of all, when it's free. Second of all, when it's available in MP3 in audio form and in text form. So I think you're a great case study about how a person can give out knowledge, either it's compiled or written themselves, and it will always have a positive kickback in all senses. Not only in, like you've said, in the sense of personal brand, but I'm sure you've gotten many other nice gifts from the universe from giving so much value, right?
Well, Roberto, you've just nailed it there. From time to time, people say, well, why haven't you monetized what you're doing? And
Right.
please understand, others who have monetized, that's legit. My statement that I've not done it doesn't mean everyone should do what I do. But what gives me the greatest value is when I get an email or a text or a phone call and somebody says, leading with questions has forever changed my leadership. I have increased my leadership effectiveness thanks to your blog. And when I hear one of those, it makes my day. And there's a MasterCard commercial that uses the tagline priceless. And when I hear those kind of comments, it's priceless.
Of course. And well, I think this gives big context as to why you're here, as to why we're going to talk about this topic, and beyond anybody saying, well, I'm an expert or I'm not an expert. I think questions themselves elicits the internal wisdom of each person.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what it's all about. That's why Socrates did it back in the day, and the Stoics were big on asking questions, and it's been here for a while. So, like you said, it's nothing new. Jesus asked questions, but the power remains because it opens to possibilities instead of collapsing probabilities and options. Right. So, getting back to this, let's go into. I'd like to ask you some questions, if that's.
I
okay.
like questions.
Of course. Of course. Now, you've already answered a lot of these, I think, so you've talked about Cru, what it is. You've given some context on that. So we covered that. Now, let me see. Let's go ahead into the book you have there on your left, which is, now that's a great question. That's a part of that book. You start with a confession. Can you tell us specifically what that was about?
Yeah. I'm happy. When people who've listened so far to this may think that asking questions comes naturally to me. And I share that that's not true. What comes naturally to me is to be a teller. I sometimes share that I'm a charter member of TA, and people aren't familiar with TA. I say, well, maybe you've heard of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, TA is Tellers Anonymous. We go to our meetings. This is fictional. And I stand up and say, my name's Bob. I'm a teller. And I'm a charter member. I'm saying that's what comes naturally. And so now that's a great question. The first chapter is the confession. And I share that for most of my career, looking back, I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I was a benevolent dictator. My only paradigm of leadership is I thought the job of a leader was to tell staff what they needed to do, to give direction. The benevolent part came from my mother. I grew up in a home where I was told, Robert, say please. Robert, say thank you. And so with my staff, I never just said, well, Roberto, go do this. It would be, hey, Roberto, could you please? And when you did it, Roberto, thank you so much. And in fact, in a staff meeting with the whole team, Roberto, please stand up. I've got to tell all of you what Roberto did this last week. And I love my staff, but again, looking back, my only paradigm of leadership was that a leader needed to tell. That all changed in 2006 when I discovered Dr. Michael Marquardt's book called Leading with Questions. I took that book home from the bookstore. It was a page turner. And as I read that book, for the first time in my life, I saw another way to lead. And I also saw, as he reinforced it and gave so many examples, instantly I embraced that leading with questions would be more effective. And Roberto, I'll illustrate it. I'll ask you a question.
Please.
It's a silly question. But if you were in a boat with your entire team and there were oars for everyone, and this is not a motorboat, it's a rowboat, and your goal is to get to the other side of the lake as quick as possible, how many of them would you like to have row with you?
Well, everybody.
Everybody, of course. I told you it was a silly question. But I then say, but then why, as a leader, would you want to sit at a conference table with that entire team? And you're the leader and you're trying to figure out what is the best way across the lake, but the lake this time is a problem or an opportunity. Why would you want to be the only one with his oar in the water? Why would you not want to engage all, in this case, brain power of everybody at the table by just simply saying, gang, what do you think we might do to solve this problem? Or what do you think we might do to take advantage of this opportunity? And then having asked, you're silent, you listen. Every time I've done that, Roberto, I've heard ideas that I hadn't thought of. Yes. Now, I still may be the leader. I still can decide, but so often I hear ideas better than anything I would have thought of. So again, let's take the next step. Roberto shares an incredible idea, and I've not thought of it. But as I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, wow, that is a great idea. And so I don't only say, Roberto, great idea. I then take one more step. I say, Roberto, would you be willing to lead our team in executing on your idea? How motivated will you be, Roberto, to make sure your idea works?
Of course, because you get buy-in. And actually, there's authors that have said that. I'm very interested after this conversation, if you can tell me where I can get the book you found, which is also called Leading with Questions, and read that. But there was a person named John Whitmore who wrote a book about coaching. And he was saying the difference between the manager, when the manager becomes a leader coach, right? And that's exactly the point. One thing between controlling and telling, and the other is, hey, how can we solve the issue? How can we be creative at creating these results? And he would get input from people. Now, I'd like to make a note here about, there's another book I love written by Stephen R. Covey, which was it came from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but it's the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teams. No, not teams, families, sorry. Families. Okay. And considering that, when you ask me the question, you ask, all right, your team. I'm like, who's my team? Well, aside that I'm an independent, I'm a freelance coach, I create content, and I have clients, I would say my team is my family, really.
Great, yeah.
So I think about that when on the boat, I was thinking about my children, my wife, and I was like, how often as a head of family do I do that? Am I a benevolent dictator, or am I asking questions from my children and my wife about how things are done? So I think that's an interesting insight.
Roberto, I heard Liz Wiseman speak, and she was sharing about leading with questions with her children. She said it just occurred to her one day that every night she was telling them what to do. Children, come, it's time for our bedtime story. Okay, children, now it's time for you to go brush your teeth. Now it's time for you to get your pajamas on. Now it's time to get in bed. And she thought, wait a minute. And so this night she changed her approach. She started with, hey, children, what is it time for us to do now? And they said, it's story time. She said, you're right. And so she shared the story with them. And she said, now what is it time to do? And they said, brush our teeth. She said, oh, that's good. And when they were done brushing, now what is it time to do? And they said, put on our pajamas.
Right.
And she said, it was so much more effective. She was letting them give the answers, and then they went and did what that next step was. And I thought, wow, I loved it. I also loved how simple it was.
Of course. Yes, it is. It is simple, because I think, what did you say? It was Tellers Anonymous? Is that
Yeah, that's where I'm a charter member.
You're a charter member? Yeah, when actually, a note, when I first listened to the book, Great Leaders Ask Questions, correct? Great Leaders Ask Questions. Yes. I remember that there was a note about that as well, and I'm like, yeah, I'm a Teller Anonymous, and I felt bad, because I'm like, well, I'm a coach, but in my personal life, I'm a Teller Anonymous, definitely, and so that's very interesting. How it's like, how can a coach in their personal life is a teller, not an asker? So that's a great reflection that you leave us with. I just want to make a note. All these resources, the books that we had reviewed before, are available on your blog. On the description of this post, I've outlined where they can get those. Okay,
Fantastic. Thank you.
And they are for free, as Bob already mentioned, and the reasons behind that. Now, going directly into something that's in the book, you commented there that you can help somebody lead with questions in 30 seconds. How is that possible? And I'm interested. I've got 30 seconds. Let's go.
Okay. Well, Roberto, whenever I'm speaking on this, I sense sometimes from different audience members that on one hand, they like the idea of learning to lead with questions would be a great thing, but they imagine that it will require getting a master's degree in questionology. In other words, a lot of work, a lot of study. It's kind of like becoming a brain surgeon. A nice idea, but probably won't happen. Mm-hmm. And so I love to encourage them by saying, I can actually teach you how to learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds. So Roberto, you're my audience today. Are you willing to try?
Yes, sir. Of course.
Roberto, you only have to memorize my 4 favorite questions. And because I sense you have a photographic memory, you'll only have to hear them one time and you'll have them memorized.
Okay.
Here we go. Question 1, what do you think? Question 2, what else? Question 3, what else? Question 4, what else? Roberto, do you have them memorized?
Yes, I do.
Share them.
What do you think? Exactly. What else? What else? What else?
Now, Roberto, you did that in less than 30 seconds.
Yes, I did.
But sometimes I sense from the audience, they're, having heard them, they're a little skeptical. Like, Bob, you can't ask somebody, what do you think? What else? What else? What else? And I say, well, of course not in that rapid order. But I asked Roberto, hey, given this opportunity we're facing or, have before us, what do you think would be the best way to do X? And Roberto answers. And I say, wow, this is good. What else? And Roberto gives me more. Now, there's some other forms of what else. I can say, Roberto, I'm taking notes. Please continue. And Roberto give me more. And Roberto, say more about that. And yes. I find experientially that it's the 3rd and 4th question that gets to their gold nugget. And what happens is when we're asked what we think about something, mm-hmm. our initial answer, and we do this subconsciously, instinctively, not with thought, but the first answer we give is we kind of roll out a safe answer to see how it will be tested. And if I ask Roberto, hey, what do you think about? And Roberto answers, and I say, well, that's dumb. Everyone knows that. Well, Roberto is sorry he answered at all. He's not going to give me another thing. But when I say, wow, what else? Well, Roberto begins to say more, but also the conversation is feeling safe. It's like, wow, Bob appreciates what I'm sharing. And so he gives me more. And I say, Roberto, continue, please. This is really good. I'm taking notes. And then I'm silent and I wait and Roberto gives me more. And Roberto's beginning to think, wow, Bob's a pretty smart guy because he understands how much wisdom I have and because he's asking me. And I think as a leader, one mistake we make when we ask a question is we only ask that first question. And then we say, well, thank you very much. And we might ask another question. And what we miss is that we would actually gain more depth, we'd get to the gold nugget by asking that additional what else. Roberto, another just kind of question I like to ask is how has, think of your career. Mm-hmm. Whenever you've had a boss, a supervisor, a leader, say, Roberto, what do you think we might do? How did that make you feel?
Well, definitely it gave me it gave me a sense of belonging, and it also gave me a sense that, well, my input was valued, definitely.
Yeah. Without that leader using words to say, I think you have wisdom, I think you have a lot to offer, just the fact that they said, Roberto, what do you think? Communicate it by the action that, wow, I have a leader who thinks that my input would be valuable. And Roberto, I'm guessing wherever an employee has experienced that, they've had a feeling like, hey, I'm in a good place. I'm in a good place because I'm respected and valued. And so I say to you as a leader, Roberto, if that's how you have felt when your leader has asked you, what do you think? How will your staff feel? Clients feel, friends feel, family feel when you say, what do you think we might do?
Right, right. And specifically as well in relationships. Bob, are you married?
I am.
All right. So how does leading with questions impact a marriage, for example? That was interesting. I don't know. I
Yeah,
just came up with that.
no, it's a great question. Uh, I have kind of here's my response to that. And it's a mistake that I may be the only husband in the world that makes this, but Sherry, that's the name of my wife, will start talking. And I'm thinking, okay, she's asking a question. And oh, yeah, I know what she's asking. And I say, well, honey, you just need to. And I start telling her what she needs to do.
Right.
And she holds up her hand and says, there you go again, Robert. She calls me Robert. There
Like
you
me.
go again. You don't even know if I'm asking a question, much less what my question is, and you're already giving me an answer.
Right. Of
And
course.
so learning to lead with questions, and we may get to this later. I always say if you're going to lead, if you're going to ask questions, what do you need to do next? Listen.
Yeah.
And also when she starts talking, I just need to listen. Sometimes she just wants to be heard. She doesn't actually have a question. But another thing that I found is that when she has a question, I have a favorite second question. In fact, Roberto, I use this second question almost whenever I'm asked a question. And so I'm asked a question and I'll say, can you please tell me more? Because what I find is that there's been too many times where somebody asked me a question and I thought, okay, I know what they want. And I give an answer. And so many people are polite.
Right.
And they don't say, well, that wasn't my question. They kind of say, well, thank you. And then they re-ask the question a slightly different way.
Right.
And
To
you
get more.
realize, okay, I completely missed their question.
Right.
So what I've learned with my wife and with others is when they ask a question, can you please tell me more? Because it makes sure that I actually understand the question and what they're asking.
Yeah.
And so that I can reply to what they're actually asking versus guessing that I know. So that's been something where I've used leading with questions. And, my children are probably a bit older than yours, all married, and we have grandchildren. But with all of them, I love to ask, hey, what do you think? It's I have a few more questions, but that one just kind of works all the time. And then say more about that. And of course, another thing that's a leader is wise to do is to say, hey, thank you for answering. Thank you for sharing. That was really good. And so, in other words, thanking people for answering your questions will pave the way down the road to ask more. And then, Roberto, one more little story. My granddaughter, who's now 13, but when she was like 3 and 4, she didn't come and sit on my lap just naturally. She was a little shy, a little standoffish. I would grab her occasionally, and she was fine with that, but she just didn't come on her own. And one day I had an idea. We were over at her home, and her name is Claire, and I said, Claire, can I ask you a tough question? And she didn't say anything, but she nodded her head. I said, well, Claire, come here. And she came closer. And I said, sit up here on my lap. And she did. And I asked her, a silly kind of question, but it was a question. And she thought a little bit and she gave me an answer. And I said, wow. And then I probably asked her another question. And I remember one I asked is 5 copycats are sitting on the fence and one jumps off. How many are left? And, and she probably said 4. And I said, none. They're all copycats. Well, she laughed. And then I would turn it around and say, well, Claire asked me a tough question. And many times she would ask me the copycat question or some version of it or something else. But questions allowed me to connect with her. And then in future visits, it almost became a routine. Grandpa, do you have a tough question for me? Yes, I do, Claire. Come sit here. And so asking each other questions became a way to connect with Claire when she was 3, 4, and 5.
And I want to add something I just want to add a side note here. One of the big reasons I'm doing this program is to actually learn from learn from talking about these things and learn from my guests. And I've been learning from all of them. And last time I had a guest and he talked about the neuroscience of leadership. And I asked him, what is the biggest thing you can tell people? He's like, pause, listen, and ask a question. Wow. That's the most powerful thing. Yeah. And then you're telling me this right now, and going back to the reference, or let's say analogy we're making about Tellers Anonymous and that metaphor, I would say that in society, we are taught not to ask questions and to listen from somebody who is not asking us questions, but is telling us. So I think in school, we're told by our parents since we're little, don't touch that, don't go there, don't, you can do this, you can't do that. Obviously, as a father, I understand I have to do that to a certain extent because, I want, my children to be safe, and there has to be some parenting there. Of course, we're older, we know more stuff. We've made those mistakes, but if we overdo that and we never leave space either in our schools or in our families or communities for there to be a habit or a balance between telling and asking questions in these very, let's say, day-to-day scenarios, right? And I think that's very powerful.
Yes. Wow. You're absolutely correct here. Someone did a little research and said that I forget the exact numbers, but it's like the average 5-year-old asks somewhere around 300 questions a day. The average college graduate, university graduate, asks only about 20. And what happens, and it's a sad part of most of our education institutions, is little Roberto at 5 is asking all sorts of questions, and then he goes to school. And the teacher, it doesn't take long, and she says, Roberto, it's my job to ask the questions. It's your job to answer them. Well, Roberto doesn't stop asking questions on the first day, but fast forward 16 years later, his questions have been trimmed down to 20 a day. And he thinks his job is to answer questions. And I'm not aware of, well, I am aware there's one program for students that teaches them how to ask questions, but it's not widely used. And yet it excites me with that thought that we would actually teach students to ask questions. I also say, you know, for those who've gone to business school, got even an MBA, did you have even one class in how to lead with questions, how to ask questions? And most would shake their head and say, no, we had no such class. We had strategic planning, we had finance, we had, you know, all sorts of things, but no, not even one class in asking questions. And yet, as we've already talked, it's one of the things that would allow any leader to increase their leadership effectiveness 3 to 10 times. Roberto, another thing I'm being a bit of a teller here, is that I'm fond of sharing, is that leadership is not as much about knowing all the right answers as it is about knowing some of the right questions. Now, if I unpack that just a little bit, back when I was a benevolent dictator, it's a heavy burden on a leader, heavy on their shoulders to think they need to have all the answers. Because the reality is none of us have all the answers. But Roberto, guess what I was tempted to do when I felt like the leader needed to have all the answers and I didn't know that I got asked a question and I didn't know the answer. Guess what I was tempted to do?
What were you tempted to do?
Make up an answer.
Even if it wasn't the right one, even if it wasn't, you're just basically fabricating.
Yes. Yeah. And my staff were kind. They were probably thinking, I don't think he really knew. I think he just made that up. But they didn't call me on it.
Right. Because you're the leader.
Yeah.
You have, you have certain level of authority. It's very interesting because I'm sure this happens in organizations all the time.
And to understand it actually can be so easy. Roberto, you get asked a question, you don't know the answer, and you say, wow, that's a really good question. What do you think the answer might be? And you just turn the question around. Well, many times they actually have an answer. Sometimes they may say, well, no, that's why I came to you. And you can say, well, you know, I've never been asked that before, so I'm not sure. Who do you think might know the answer to this? And or who do you think might know, who would know the answer to this? And or, you know, where can we go together to get the answer? The fact is, you just need to have some of the questions. And it's actually refreshing to the staff because when we ask a question, we don't expect our leaders to have answers to everything. And when they actually say, gosh, great question, I don't think I have an answer to that. What do you think? It actually creates relationship between us.
Actually, Bob, I want to reference, there's something happening and there's a shift happening in management and what is relevant in the development of leaders. And that's the question that you're answering already before I even asked it is, you stated that by asking questions, leaders can get 10 times more results, and you're actually telling us how that happens and why that happens. But before that, I want to say that there are authors right now who are really shouting this from the rooftops. Michael Bungay Steiner, who wrote a book about the coaching habit, which is about asking questions.
Yes.
He has a new book, says I think just give you the note. The book is called The Advice Trap. And he talks about the same exact thing we are conversing about now. And really, aside from that, you have leading with questions with you and all the movement. I think it's called, it's created a movement of understanding that leaders become leaders because of their technical expertise. But then when they're leaders, they understand that the technical or the intellectual aspect that they have will not make them good leaders. It will make them benevolent dictators or tellers anonymous. Yeah. So that's what leaders have to reconfigure. Like, wait, I got to be a leader because I know the answers, because I've known the answers for years. I've solved problems. I've gotten my company to where it is. I've been a star. And now it's time for me to continue to lead my team to more results. And I think they hit a wall when the morale goes down and things go down the tubes, and then they get fired or demoted. That's very common. And I think that what we're talking about now, what these authors are putting out these books saying, hey, especially in COVID times, moving forward, leadership is not about having the answers. It never was. It's about asking questions and being open and vulnerable to understand that you can't do everything and you don't have the answers to everything, right? As a leader.
I was not aware of Michael Bengay's new book. I'll grab that. He's been kind enough to do a guest post on my blog, but it was related to his first book. But, you know, you're so right, Roberto, what you just shared here. I'm remembering a number of years ago, I heard Liz Wiseman speak. She is author of the book Multipliers. And going to hear her, I thought this is going to be fabulous because she's going to be talking about leaders like me, multipliers. Well, she started her talk saying, I want to share with you what diminisher leaders do. Well, at that point, I thought, well, she's talking about somebody else. That wouldn't apply to me. But then she started giving examples. She said, when you bring a diminisher leader a problem, they solve it for you. And I thought, well, sure, that's what a multiplier leader does. I mean, yeah, I love it when staff bring me problems. But she was calling that a diminisher quality. She said a multiplier leader is going, you know, Roberto brings me a problem, and instead of solving it, I say, Roberto, tell me more. Roberto, what do you think the solution is? And I turned the question right around. I let Roberto actually solve his own problem. She said, that's what a multiplier leader does. Second, she said, when you bring a diminisher leader a new idea, they say, great idea, but Roberto, you know, if you only also did this and this and this, it would really make that idea just really come to life. And again, I thought that was helpful. I thought my staff were leaving my office thinking, wow, I'm so glad I shared my idea with Bob because he really added horsepower to it. Well, Liz Wiseman said, nope. Staff, after they've had that experience 2 or 3 times, won't come back because their thought is, no matter what I ever bring to my leader, it's never good enough. He's always got to point out and add, you know, what it would take to make it great. Well, she said the multiplier leader just says, wow, Roberto, great idea. What can I do to help?
And sorry. I was going to make, I was going to make a comment in regards to for a leader to do that, the leader would actually have to, number one, be open to uncertainty, that if they allow or delegate or give the power over of that decision to the person, they have to trust. I think that's the word. There has to be trust and vulnerability. And I think maybe when leaders are under pressure, I put myself in that same situation. My style or the style is to grab control. Say uncertain moments, people are coming with ideas. Wait, if I allow you to do that, it's risky. I need to have control, but it's all illusion anyways, because once you have control, you think you're going to solve it, but maybe that person knows a lot more. So there seems to be a balance between understanding, first of all, you can't control everything. You probably don't control most of the things you think you control. Second of all, allowing or delegating that power, empowering the person allows you to trust and be open to the one upstairs to help you out.
Yes.
So I think that's definitely powerful. Based on all this.
Well, with also for boomers like me who are leading millennials like you, the reality is that millennials love to work in places where their input is valued, requested. And so if you're a boomer leader that has a staff of millennials, one of the things is that leading them with questions will motivate them, excite them. It fits exactly the kind of workplace they want to be a part of. And reflecting on one more thing, as a leader, as you ask questions, you still have the right to make the final decision. And in other words, if if Roberto shares an idea and I'm actually thinking, I think that one's not going to work, I'm probably then not going to say, Roberto, great idea, why don't you execute on that? Because I wouldn't want you to, go down a trail that I think it could be really problematic.
Right.
So, you don't give up complete control, but the thing that's so exciting though, is that you are going to hear so many ideas you wouldn't have thought of.
Right.
And when you hear a great idea you haven't thought of and you empower them to move with that one. And again, you can still have control in terms of, let's try that. Let's take it to here and then evaluate how it's going and any adjustment. In other words, you don't have to bet the bank, the whole annual budget on their idea. You can do it as a pilot. Let's see how that works. It's more like R&D, and you spend money, and then you even reward, at least verbally, a failure. There's a story. I wish I could give all the details, but way back in the start of IBM, a young employee made a colossal mistake that cost IBM, I don't know the exact dollar amount, but $20,000-$30,000, a large amount, especially given the time in which it took place. And the president of IBM called him in, and he came in and he started with saying, I know you need to let me go. I know you need to fire me. I'm so sorry. You have every right to show me the door. He was saying those kind of things. And the president said, what? No. I'm not letting you go elsewhere. We just made a $20,000 investment in your development. I don't want another company to be the beneficiary of that.
Right.
And your job here is secure. Well, can you imagine how loyal that employee was thereafter?
Of course.
Because he was believed in, and because it was like, it's okay to fail. What can we learn from it, though?
Of course. And these are things that recently authors have been mentioning. There's a book about fail often, fail fast. Yes. There's another great book about think fast, think slow. And I think the book about think fast and thinking slow, asking questions, forces us to think slow, right? And forces us to reflect and forces us to move forward in a way that is not just putting out fires so that we can survive the next day. So I think it really, it seems to be a paradox because, like you said, of course, the leader can't give complete control over, but asking question gives the leader more freedom to move forward in a way that is wiser and in a way that is more inclusive. So it's not really about control or not control. Things that need to be controlled for the sake of their, because they're there because they have the experience, right? To know what may work, may not work, but not allow that experience to trump the capacity to include the input and ideas of their team. And that's where I think is the bridge in questions. That's how questions bridges that gap.
Yes.
Right. So amazing. This is I'm learning so much. I want to thank you so much for this. I'm learning a lot. And well, going back to something I want to touch on before we end the show, and it's about saying no. There's a chapter in there that talks about saying no. After we've reviewed and we've discussed all these different nuances to asking questions in personal life and in organizations, how does this play in to all this, saying no?
Well, it's another, as you said, another chapter of the book, and it's kind of like, I start with the question, do you ever say yes to something? And even while you're saying yes, you're thinking to yourself, why did I just do that? I already have a full plate. I already, have more than enough to do. Why did I just say yes?
Yes.
And you and many others may have what I call even a knee-jerk response to being asked to do something. Because you want to be a good person, a friend comes up, somebody calls and says, hey, could you do this? And your instant answer is yes. But even while you're saying it, you're thinking, oh, why did I do that? And so the chapter goes on to say, would you like to have a couple of questions that will allow you to make better decisions on what you say yes to or what you say no to? And I also find, let me just state, that a person who knee-jerk is to say yes, you cannot give them the advice, just say no. That they are not capable of just saying no. They're not wired to just, hey, Roberto, could you help me with this? No, just not capable. But here are two questions that will allow that person to make a better decision. First question, Roberto, could you tell me more about that? In other words, you hear that initial request and now ask more about it, because just hearing more of the details buys you some more time to think, do I have time? It also lets you better understand what the request is, because sometimes you think you know, and it's like me, you don't really know the full thing. So
Right.
get the full thing. And then the second question is to say, could I have, it could be an hour, it could be a day, it could be a week. Could I have a day to give your request the careful consideration it deserves? Now, I've never had anyone refuse these two questions. The first question, can you please tell me more? They'll tell you more. And then when you say, could I have an hour or a day to give your request the careful consideration it deserves? I've never had anyone say no. It's like, well, sure. Then I can go away and I can spend a little time thinking about it. And I have a friend, and this applies here, and it's in this chapter, that says wisdom is putting process between opportunity and decision. And, Roberto calls me up, says, Bob, do you want to buy my car? And I say, yes. Well, there's no process between opportunity and decision. Roberto calls me up, says, Bob, do you want to buy my car? Roberto, what kind of car is it? How many miles does it have on? Has it ever been in an accident? Why are you selling it? How much do you want for it? And, we would do that. But based on that, then you can make a more intelligent decision. So having that hour, that day also, though, should you need to say no, gives you time to craft a diplomatic no. You may respond to say, Roberto, thank you so much for asking. As I've looked at it, I already have too many things on my plate that I've already said yes to. And so I'm going to have to decline, but please know I was honored by your request. And if I had time, doing this for you is something I'd love to do. Wow, you've said it in a way in which you're now affirming. It doesn't come across like, no, I don't care about you. No, I don't want to do it. The person feels good, even though you've declined the opportunity. So that's the chapter on how do you say no.
And I for example, I'll say a great example. I invite people to this show all the time, and I've gotten a couple of no's. And the people who have said no are kind, and they craft their response, like you said. And so I think, and when I receive it, I say, great. And actually, I prefer, because also I've had the other thing happen that people ghost you. So you ask and they just never respond because maybe they don't want to feel uncomfortable just saying no. Yeah. And that actually comes off worse, really. So because by saying no in a way that is respectful, you are saying no with integrity. And I know that by inviting someone, I'm going to get a no. It's part of it. I mean, I don't feel bad about that. But I think it plays into, as leaders, we have to really be empathetic and understanding that if we're going to say no to something, taking the time, right? Figuring out a way to take the time to consider the no, and how am I going to frame the no in a way that respects the relationship and respects both of the parties. Yes. So I think that requires wisdom, and those are things that I think a leader should prioritize, right? of course, within that. But then that's my
And
personal opinion.
And Roberto, I also point out that when you ask those two questions, can you please tell me more? Can you give me time to give your request the careful consideration it deserves? It still allows you then to say yes to those things you truly want to do that you have time to do. So it's the value of those two questions, though, is it gives you process, so you don't end up saying yes to something only wondering, even before yes is finished coming out of your mouth, why did I do that?
Of course, that's happened to me too many times. A compulsive yes sayer to everything. Yes. But I've that's been resonating in my mind because I've been hearing a lot of people talking about that. Again, by default, the things you say yes to, you're automatically saying no to many things. By saying no to things, you're automatically saying yes. And being aware of what that trade-off is at the moment you're saying yes or no is very valuable, not only for personal well-being, but it makes you come off with more integrity, and it really helps your self-esteem and helps the way other people perceive you, because that's a big part of leadership as well. How are others perceiving you? In speaking of leadership in itself, right? That's very critical. But aside from that, I want to close with the following question, if that's okay.
Please.
Is that okay? All right. And if a leader is going to ask questions, what does he or she need to do next in this to continue to develop this muscle of question asking?
Well, the obvious answer is you have to listen. If you're not going to listen to the answer, you shouldn't ask the question. You'd be actually better off not asking a question than to ask it and then not listen. And so in my book, there's also a chapter on some tips to becoming a better listener. And I'll start with telling you one that doesn't work. And the tip here is just to know this one doesn't work. Roberto, if you were a baseball player and you had a batting coach and he was carefully watching you swing the bat and studying you, and finally he calls you over and you walk over because you're now listening, he's going to give you some tips on being better. And he just shouts at you and says, Roberto, you just need to try harder. How helpful would that be?
Not much.
Not
at all.
Very much. Well, for years and years and years, my tip to myself when somebody said that I wasn't a good listener, just kind of like, okay, I just need to try harder. And I'm here to share with you that never has worked. So let me share a tip that actually has worked. I don't know if there's, it's the 8-second rule.
Yeah.
Now, when you think of 8 seconds, is there any sport that comes to mind?
American football. I don't know. I'm sorry.
No problem. I realize it's very American. It's in rodeo. It's bull riding.
Oh, bull riding. Okay.
In bull riding, even if you are not a fan of the sport, the bull rider has to stay on the bull for 8 seconds for it to be a qualified ride. And if you watch the sport, it's like 75-80% of the bull riders, and they're all professionals,
right,
are knocked off the bull in less than 8 seconds. And so for a bull rider, those 8 seconds are like an eternity. Yes. And you're thinking, Bob, okay, but what does that have to do with listening? Here's what it has to do with listening. When we ask a question and there's silence, that silence becomes like eternal. And so just like the bull rider, it seems to last for an eternity. And so again, without thought, what most people instinctively do is they'll ask a question, they'll wait. And if the other person doesn't answer in 2 or 3 seconds, they will either re-ask the question, ask a different question, answer the question themselves, or just move on. with total unawareness of what they've just done. And so my first tip is ask the question and then relax, keep comfortable eyesight, contact with your eye, but count to yourself. 1001, 1002, 1003. Roberto, there's times I've gotten to 1030. But the longer the silence, the better the answer. Now, if I'm at your home or place of work and I say, which way to the restroom? Well, you are going to answer that one, with a second or two. But if I said, Roberto, I've got a question for you. What would you say have been your 2 or 3 greatest failures? And what did you learn from those failures that actually led to success? Well, if you've never been asked that question before,
it'll take me a while.
It'll take you a while.
Yeah, it'll probably take a minute to answer.
Yeah,
think about it.
But even while you're thinking, I interrupt with another question, or I interrupt and just go on in the conversation. It's like I'll never benefit from hearing what would be an incredible answer. And so when you ask a great question, the 8-second rule is count to yourself and wait. They will answer. And don't step on the silence, but let it just be there to give them time.
So I have a question. Now, my question is, number one, I'll say this out loud. I think out loud. Has the overimportance of telling and being told diminished our capacity to connect with other humans? And if so, how will asking questions reconnect us with one another? I don't know the answers to that, but that just came up.
My friend Andrew Sobel, who co-authored a great book called Power Questions, there's a quote in that book where he says, telling creates resistance, but asking creates relationships. And when you think about it, when we tell people, Roberto, let me tell you what you need to do, and then I tell you, well, kind of the instinctive response is we don't like being told. Who's Bob think he is to tell me what to do? And even if it's kind of a respected friend, it's kind of like, I don't, that, again, it may even at times be subconscious. It's like, I don't feel real good about that. But when not just Bob, but anyone says, hey, Roberto, tell me your story, and then listens, well, Roberto shares his story.
Right.
And feels like, wow. When I say, Roberto, wow, you've been doing this podcast and successfully. How'd you get started with that? And then I listen. And what else? And what else? And what else? Wow, if I ever wanted to start a podcast, what do you think would be the kind of like 3 or 4 things to really know that would, provide a solid foundation for somebody who wants to start? And you focus on asking, and Roberto, again, it's not just Roberto, anyone will begin to feel like, wow, I'm enjoying this conversation. Because somebody is asking and listening. I read the seminary student was doing a paper, and he put an ad in the paper that said, for $25, I will listen to you for 30 minutes without interruption. And he did it kind of as a funny test. But the ad started getting responses where people were paying him $25 just to listen for 30 minutes. And so I think if when we want to relate to somebody, it may be counterintuitive, but asking about them is going to do more to develop the relationship than telling them all sorts of things that you think would be wise for them to know.
Yeah. And it makes me think, I have a lot of friends who are coaches, and that we're always talking about how can we market coaching in a way that so people can understand what the value is. So I'm going to tell them, you know what, my friend, basically put up a flyer saying, I'll listen to you for 30 minutes and I'll ask questions that'll help you feel better about everything in your life. Pay me. It never mentioned the word coaching in that, and just saying, I'll listen to you. And that's beautiful, because when you say, okay, I'm a coach, I'm going to give you coaching, people are like, what is that? You know what? We're going to sit in a virtual room together and I'm going to listen to you for 40 minutes and might ask some interesting questions to help you. Would you like that? It'd be okay. How much is it? So thank you for that. That's a problem solved there with that. That's amazing. Well, Bob, so I'm so excited to have had you here today. I've learned so much from you, and I'm just very excited we have the space here. Again, for everybody who wants to connect with Bob Tiede, in the description, you have a way to contact him on his blog and where you can download the resources, of course, in MP3 and in PDF format, correct?
Correct.
Bob? All right. Well, that's about it, my friend.
Roberto.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It has been my pleasure. You are a great host. You have a great podcast, and I'm honored to have spent this hour with you.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope this goes on for a long time. I'm committed to this, and we'll see where this goes. This is exciting. It's part of the deal of doing it. All right, my friend. So I'll communicate with you a little later. I'm gonna basically close off the show here. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, thank you everybody for the sixth episode, the second episode in English, and the episode was about leading with questions with Bob Tiede. You can get all the information for how you can reach out to him in the description, and you can reach out to me at my Linktree, Roberto Mendana Coach. And if you'd like coaching or would like help on setting up something like this and a podcast or a live stream. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon and see you next time.